Hello everybody and welcome to Organian's Puzzle Box. I've put a special video together for you guys for Unreal Engine 5 and for Surface Forge 1.1. This tutorial will show you how you can retexture your meshes that you can get on an marketplace or the ones that you've made yourself. Maybe you want to add new textures to it or reuse the textures that you've already made in Substance Painter or something like that, and then use them with the Surface Forge and upgrade them in terms of fidelity, adding displacement, adding all sorts of things that can be found in the features of the Surface Forge. So this tutorial is going to be straight to the point. This one that I'm releasing here is going to go through this process step by step and provide you quite a very good understanding of what the options are. But there's also a long form video that's going to be available on my Patreon for free if you want to watch that. It's an extensive sort of look at all the things that are put in place in this video. So if you enjoy, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. If you want to try the Surface Forge yourself, head on over to Patreon or have a look on the Fab link. I'm sure you'll find loads of things in there. And also there is a sponsor for this video as well, so yeah, I'll tell you guys about the details of that very soon. Okay, so this is a building I pulled straight off of CGTrader, and this is the same building after I ran it through the Surface Forge. Every surface retextured and displacement on the brick and other layers. We've obviously tried to do our best here to just improve the resolution and fidelity of this, and in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll show you exactly how I got from one to the other. Now a quick word on where this building came from, because it's from CGTrader, who are sponsoring this video. And it's genuinely a good asset because CGTrader is where I go whenever I want a clean base to build rather than starting from scratch on an asset. Their library is huge and you'll find something for almost any project that you may have. And these meshes tend to come very properly built, like this one with proper material slots, UVs and textures, and they're not a mess. Now, if you want to actually get 10% off, use the code PuzzleBox10, link in the description below if you want to get your assets with 10% off, so yeah. Okay, so here's what we're starting with. The Blender file straight from CGTrader. And the first thing worth pointing out is how cleanly this asset is built. It's part of a collection, and we've got one mesh, but a proper set of material slots for things like wood, the metal framing around window, the stucco on the walls, the brick underneath, the metal roof, and the glass. Everything's already separated for us, which is going to matter a lot later when we build a new shader. Now, before this mesh goes anywhere, I do the usual housekeeping in Blender. It's important that you zero out the location, set the 3D cursor into the world origin, throw in a cube just to check on scale, maybe even a mannequin from Unreal Engine if you want. And if it's about right, set the origin where you want the pivot to be, and apply all the transforms, rotation to 0 and scale of 1. Just make sure you actually use apply all transforms rather than setting the scale to 1, because that's not going to work as you think. Anyway, this is nothing exciting, but skip this and you will actually have a problem later on in Unreal. And like I've mentioned before, every slot already ships with its own textures. You got base color, normal, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion in some cases. Now, I could export these one at a time, but there's no need. If you just export the mesh as an FBX and smoothing set to face, pretty much, make sure you've got selected object in there and you're done. You can just export it as an FBX and bring it over into Unreal. Over in Unreal Engine, I import with combined meshes turned on. You might also want to have Nanite enabled here if you want to. This will set the whole thing, as coming into one piece, which is what we want. And Unreal automatically rebuilds all the materials and pulls in every texture from the Blender export from the FBX. You can then drop this into the world next to the mannequin and the scales bang on if you've actually done the resizing and the scale properly in Blender. Again, this isn't going to be available for all the assets that you might get on CGTrader, but most of them will come with this as a standard. As I look at the asset in Unreal, I realize that the stock textures that came from CGTrader, they actually look better than they did in Blender. But, it's just really a matter of opinion, but you get more depth out of the normal maps. You get up close, they kind of start to fall apart because even though some of them or most of them are 4K, the reality is that there's a lot of texture information put into one UV space for a lot of different parts of this mesh. So the textile density is actually being stretched quite a lot here. But the Surface Forge will not have this problem, as you will come to see. Potentially, in a third-person game, this won't really be a problem because you will not get that close to the mesh anyway. But in first person, the texture from up close can really fall apart. And that's what I sort of try to aim to fix, but on top of that, also add depth via displacement or parallax occlusion mapping. Now for texture work, I will go to Megascan and grab a few of them from there. Now a lot of people will have access to these if they've claimed them. If not, feel free to use whatever textures you might have available. What I want to get is a brick, a stucco material, some rusty metal sheathing, and possibly a bit of decking, wood type of material. We're not doing anything exotic. All stuff you've got access to, all of it plays nicely with the Surface Forge straight out of the box. Textures from Quixel can come in various formats, but as long as you have a base color, roughness, metallic, normal, displacement, and ambient occlusion, you can actually use the texture graph in order to put all of these textures together. If you don't know how to do that, I do have a tutorial link in the description for you to follow, and this will allow you to just use the texture graph and get these set up. It's quite an easy setup, to be honest, and everybody should know it if you are planning to use Unreal Engine in any serious capacity. Okay, so now you've got some textures, that's fine, but you want to move on to adding some materials onto your surface. Now with the Surface Forge, you get a bunch of material instances, so you could just drop one straight in for this building. And for this, we're actually going to take a material instance and drop it on the wall material slot, and instantly this takes over. Now, you'll notice that the wall's still flat, nanite is enabled on the mesh, displacement is enabled in the material, yet you're still getting a flat surface. Now this is because Surface Forge may come with masks on for displacement on the alpha channel. This could be a toggle that could be on, and the second I disable this, it will ignore the mask. And there it is, the brick will now push out and allow for the surface to properly display. Now you've got to understand that the mask is not a bug, it's actually a feature. It lets me control where displacement shows up. So I'm not pushing the bricks out across the whole building if I don't want to, or if I have any geometrical problems or edge issues, whether I want it or not. The lucky thing about the CGTrader asset pack that I'm currently using is that the edges are perfectly done. They are actually beveled quite faintly to allow for displacement to move from one side to the next quite nicely. Now you can paint that with the vertex color or with mesh paint. So you basically can hide the displacement on your geometry, and this allows you to really push the customization of your mesh in Surface Forge. But even with just this, stock brick texture that we've added, look at the difference, especially on the displacement side and also the amount of detail. All of a sudden, the up-close camera that didn't hold up a few minutes ago is now quite fine in the new shader. Now, one of the defining features of the Surface Forge is this part that I really want you to understand, because it's the heart of how the Surface Forge works. The wall material isn't just one texture stack, it's actually a stack of layers. We've got layer A as a base, layer B as an additional blend, and layer C as the final layer. Layer A can be a base, let's say, basic texture. That could also be the default texture that came from CGTrader. Layer B is the brick, and layer C is the stucco in this particular example. Now, each layer is determined by, a set of variables where it shows up. It can be driven by the vertex color painting. It could be by mesh painting. It could be by a texture mask. Now, if you paint everything all green, the whole building reads as the brick layer. If you do that color in vertex or mesh paint mode. Now, if you erase the green color, it drops back to the base layer underneath, which would be layer A. Paint red, and now it's blending the brick and the stucco together. And you're not going to get a flat blend either. It's actually going to be a height-based blend between the two layers. So this is reading the height. So the brick comes through in the low points of the stucco is actually worn away. And there's a transition control to push exactly how hard the blend, works or bites or transitions. Now, looking at this stucco material that we got from Quixel, I realized that the repeatable tiling is very obvious. And that, to be honest, actually drives me mad. But luckily, I have implemented a solution in the Surface Forge, which is called UV Breakup. This will chop the texture into cells and scrambles the pattern. With a tiny bit of rotation, you actually, can just get the tiling to disappear. At the very least, you can experiment until you get the result that you want. You can use this on any particular layer that you want, but obviously things like bricks may not work very well because they have an order to them as opposed to a chaotic stucco looking texture. Now there is another layer in play here, which is a curvature layer, but it's not using a full texture set. That is disabled right now. We don't actually need it. But if you can see, if you turn this curvature layer off, the colors, dead uniform on the stucco. When you turn it on, it reads the shape of the surface and lets me drop an additional shade based on a texture mask into this stucco material. It will just add a bit of a, grime or age or just contrast and intensity. So now we actually want to start placing the layers onto the mesh. And usually my first instinct is just go with vertex color painting. But you can probably see that there's a problem here. There are just not enough vertices in the wall to paint anything precise. So you just kind of have to work it out or add more vertices if this is the way you want to go. Now, you are not locked into this option, by the way. You can use other methods here. You can use textures, you can use types of blends, height blending, you can use masks, you can use curvature, you can use all sorts of things. But there's also mesh painting. So I switch over to mesh painting, which paints to a texture instead of vertices. So you get way more control. But there is one catch. The material's listening to vertex color by default, but when I switch over to mesh paint, it might be able to override in some instances. But there is another caveat here. Mesh painting is 100% dependent on the UV of the mesh, meaning that if you have overlapping UVs or anything like that, you will start getting some issues, and you will see that in just a bit. So you can kind of see that paint bleeding onto walls I never touched, and if you jump into Blender, you'll be able to see why. The wall shells overlap in UV space. The front wall and the back wall are sitting in the same spot on the UV map. Now that's completely normal for an asset like this, nothing wrong with how it's built, and Surface Forge does have a way around it without you ever redoing the UVs, but feel free to consider doing that if you'd like, or separate them on multiple materials. It's really up to you, but the Surface Forge does have a solution in place, so to speak. So the solution in question is I work it from both ends. Vertex color for the broad strokes, where I want more brick, low down and less on the top. I could increase the vertex count if I wanted to, but then I'm also going to use mesh paint for the fine details. And after a bit of back and forth, this is what I land on. We've got brick breaking through up the sides and along the base. I'm, blending into the stucco. It's already reading closer to the original reference, but obviously we can push this into whatever direction we want. We don't have to make it identical to the reference or anything like that. Just do whatever you feel fits your need. So moving on from the walls, we now want to look at the roof and the door. And here's a little efficiency point. In Blender, those two are actually on the same material slot. So I don't need to separate setups. We can have one Surface Forge metal instance that covers both the door and the roof. And I've got the rusty roof and a beaten up door out of a single material. Although you might have issues with painting if you've got overlapping UVs, so mesh painting could be an issue. If you're using vertex painting, that could be fine. But again, the issue with that will be that you might not have enough vertices to work with. Now the roof, I'm happy with. The door, maybe you'd rather it match the original asset exactly. Not a problem. And this is where we can reuse the instance of the textures that we got from CGTrader. We can just add those in as a base. So in the same material where I've got the roof and the door, I just turn off the tint on the base layer, turn off world aligned projection, don't need it on, on a flat door. We're going to flatten the color adjustments back to neutral. and we'll feed in the original door's base color and normal, so the exact texture the asset shipped with will be running onto the Surface Forge instance. Now in this particular case, there is no ambient occlusion that came for the door, so I can pack it as a like a white texture into an ORM. So we can use white for occlusion. We've got the roughness, we got metallic. Obviously, this door doesn't have a metal type of texture on it, but we can still pack it. You just got to make sure that when you create the ORM, you use the texture graph and then just feed in these textures and combine them into one texture stack. And that's because you want to save on, on memory. So you don't have 3 different textures, right? You stack them together. And because we're using the Surface Forge to do this, I actually have controls even for this layer where I'm using the stock textures that came with from CGTrader. I can crank the normal up for a bit more prop. I can even play with some fake ambient occlusion. I can do tints and whatnot if I want to. So, I've got a brand new roof and the original door side by side. So, they're actually better than stock textures right now. So we've got the buildings next to each other, the old texture set and the new shader. This is what came off the shelf and this is where we've taken it. Just take a look, breathe it in and just see the comparison and the differences. Some things that we can look after is, things like the crisper brick, the real displacement. We've got, some wear and tear here and there on the texture. A roof that's got a different texture, more high quality, more resolution at least. We've got the door with actual character, and it still moves at the scale we need in the engine. So overall, I would say that the geometry is the same, the UVs have stayed the same, we've reused some of the textures and we created some new ones. And this is very important because we've art directed something that came from a bundle or from a pack, and this just gave you the flexibility of just reshaping this inside of an Unreal Engine without having to go to other software to start editing. But we've also got to talk about the cost of all of this, because you can pull up the performance view with Alt 8 on the keyboard. A live Surface Forge material is heavier than a flat one. So the last piece is baking it down to cheap textures if you'd like to save. But if you do that, you obviously lose quite a lot of the flexibility that the Surface Forge provides, but that exists as an option within the engine. But now I'm going to have to be honest with you, because this building, you can't really cleanly bake it. Those overlapping UVs we saw earlier mean that the bake fights itself when you try to make it. And anything you did with the mesh painting won't survive the bake. So baking will only work with vertex painting for now. So for the walkthrough, I switched to a cleaner object from within the pack. We've got a barrel, we've got the same Surface Forge setup, but it's got proper non-overlapping UVs, so baking should be easier for us to show. I'm going to show you the process, and then you can use that on whatever you want, including this building, if you clean up the UVs. Now I've used the layer that I've used on the surface on the building. I built it up the same way. We've got wood and metal as 2 layers. They're world aligned, so the grain runs right, or at least as close as we can get it without using a baked texture. Displacement is turned on, so we've actually got something to bake, because I want to show you how to bake the other textures, but also displacement, which is quite an important bit. A lot of people will want to save their asset with actual displacement as well. Now, by default, the baker inside Unreal Engine will not allow you to bake displacement, but there is a workaround for this. You have to go in the Surface Forge main shader and route the height information through an emissive channel with a static switch if you'd like, so you can keep the emissiveness as a functionality. You have to flip the shading to unlit onto the material instance that you're using, and you will be able to see the displacement on the barrel if everything is done correctly. That white is the displacement, and depending on what kind of gradients or contrast you'd have, you'd be able to see, a deeper, darker displacement or a whiter one. It really depends on what type of displacement you got on the asset that you're working on. And you can easily bake that displacement out. You can also bake the color, roughness, and normal after you've done this emissive. Just make sure that you switch back to lit mode, and you also make sure that you turn that switch off so you don't have using it for height blending. And then you want to rebuild this material with the textures that you've got out. Just make sure that you save the textures from the resulting bake. And then you've got something that costs a fraction of the live version if you want. Very important to know about the bake is that it's not quite razor sharp as the live material, because you're kind of losing a lot of that quality when you do the bake, because it will be dependent on the UV of the mesh. So if your barrel has a a small UV footprint inside when it's being created, then you're not really going to be using the maximum textile density. So just be aware of that. You might want to edit the UVs to take advantage of this bake. But with that said, you're going to get a baked result. Like I've said, won't look as good as the Surface Forge natively, but it'll still do the job. And that's what I had to show you as a whole journey for this CGTrader asset. We brought it from Blender into Unreal, and then we used Surface Forge on it, and we layered it. There is more that we could do. There's more customization to put in place. We obviously would just repeat the same steps that we've done in this video so far, and we would be able to fully transform this building into whatever we want. Bear in mind that the Surface Forge comes with a lot of different options that allows you to make it, rainy, or allow it to make it wet, or with snow, or whatever else you might need. This asset from CGTrader gave us a brilliant, clean starting point. Everything was good about it. We kept it and we built on top of it. Now, the full unskipped step-by-step tutorial, including the complete baking workflow, is over on Patreon. So you can have a look there. It's going to be a free video placed on Patreon. At some point, I might place it onto YouTube as well, but we'll see. Thank you for CGTrader for sponsoring this video. Thank you guys for watching it. And I also wanted to say, you can get the Essential subscription for $9.99 a month, which gives you 25 downloads for you to download every month. I think it's very good for prototyping. I've got to say, it's quite low value for effectively very high quality assets. So feel free to take a look at the subscription plan if you want. I'm actually subscribed myself, so I'm using it quite often because I have a lot of work for clients to do. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.